Right now, as you're watching this, Apple has more cash parked offshore than the entire GDP of Portugal. Google moved $75 billion in a single year to a tiny island most Americans can't find on a map. And Meta avoided over $15 billion in taxes using a trick so absurd, accountants named it after a cocktail. The island? Ireland. Population? 5 million. Smaller than the state of Kentucky. And here's the kicker. The United States government knew about all of it. And for decades, they let it happen. So how does the world's most powerful economy lose $1 trillion to a country with more sheep than skyscrapers? Let's go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with greed, it starts with desperation. We rewind to 1987. Ireland is broke. Unemployment is at 17%. Young people are leaving by the hundreds of thousands. The joke going around Dublin is, last one to leave, turn off the lights. The Irish government is staring into an abyss, and they make a decision, a radical one. They slash their corporate tax rate to 12.5%. Now remember, America's rate at this time? 35%. The global average? Around 23%. Ireland just blew the doors off the room. The message to every U.S. corporation was crystal clear. Come here. Bring your profits. We won't ask too many questions. And the Americans came. At first, it made sense. Ireland spoke English. It was inside the European Union, meaning one entity in Dublin gave you access to 450 million EU consumers. Educated workforce, pro-business government, and that tax rate sitting there like a neon sign in the dark. By the late 1990s, Dell, Intel, Microsoft, they're all setting up shop. Dublin starts getting called Silicon Docks. A city that was practically medieval 20 years earlier now has Google's European headquarters sitting on the River Liffey. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's where the story goes from smart business move to something else entirely. The corporations weren't just moving offices to Ireland. They were moving something far more valuable. They were moving their ideas. Let's talk about how this actually worked. And I promise, it's both more clever and more infuriating than you think. Think of it like this. Apple built the recipe for the iPhone. The phone itself is made in China. But the recipe, the secret formula, the patent, the intellectual property is worth way more than the physical phone. Whoever owns the recipe collects a royalty on every single iPhone sold on the planet. Apple moved that recipe to Ireland. So every time an iPhone is sold in Europe, Asia, or Africa, the profit flows not to California, but to Dublin. American engineers, American universities, American infrastructure. But the money? Gone to a small island off the coast of Britain. Except, and here's where it gets truly wild, Apple Ireland didn't even pay Irish taxes. Because while the company was registered in Ireland, the meetings happened in the Cayman Islands. Here's the loophole. Ireland says, you only pay taxes here if your bosses sit here. The Caymans say, we only tax you if you're registered here. Apple Ireland was registered in Ireland, but managed from the Caymans. So Ireland said, not our problem. The Caymans said, not our problem. And Apple said, perfect. The result? A company that was nobody's tax resident, existing in a legal no man's land, paying taxes to nobody. Apple's effective tax rate on European profits in 2014, 0.005%. Not 5%, not 0.5%, 0.005 on tens of billions in profit. The architects of this scheme had a name for it, the double Irish. Two Irish companies, one Dutch shell in the middle to shuffle the royalties around, and suddenly $75 billion of Google's profits vanish into the Bermuda sunshine without a cent of tax paid anywhere. But how was any of this even legal? One word, Washington. U.S. tax law had a loophole called check the box. Imagine the IRS has a form, and one of the boxes says, is this foreign subsidiary a real company or just a filing cabinet? And the law says you can check whichever box you want. So Apple checked, filing cabinet. And the IRS said, cool, we'll pretend it doesn't exist. That's it. That's the whole trick. The rule was introduced in 1997, quietly, with almost no public debate, and it was the master key that made the double Irish possible. Without it, the whole structure collapses. It wasn't illegal, not technically. Every piece of paper was signed, every box checked. The lawyers billed thousands of hours. The accountants got Christmas bonuses, and the U.S. Treasury watched $1 trillion, a trillion with a T, accumulate offshore, untaxed, unreachable. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, a small business owner paid 21% federal tax on every dollar she made. A teacher in Texas had Medicare taken out of every paycheck. The game was rigged, and everyone in the room knew it. Congress knew. The IRS knew. And for 2 decades, during Republican and Democratic administrations alike, nothing happened. Because the companies lobbying to keep the loophole open were the same companies funding the campaigns. Enter the consultants. Enter the law firms. Enter the former Treasury officials who walked through the revolving door into 6-figure advisory roles at the very multinationals they once regulated. This wasn't an accident. It was architecture. The crack started showing around 2013. A U.S. Senate subcommittee drags Apple CEO Tim Cook to Washington. Senators, clearly briefed, clearly furious, start asking questions about Apple Ireland. Tim Cook, calm as ever, says Apple follows every law in every country where it operates, which is technically true, and somehow makes it worse. Then the EU starts sniffing around. The EU has one hard rule. You cannot give one company a secret sweetheart deal that no other company gets. That's called illegal state aid. Basically, the government secretly playing favorites. And in 2016, the European Commission drops the hammer. Apple owes Ireland 13 billion euros in back taxes. Ireland's response? They appealed the ruling. They didn't want the money. Read that again. Ireland sued the EU to avoid receiving 13 billion euros. Because taking it would have sent a message to every other multinational. Ireland is no longer safe. And Ireland's entire economic model depends on that safety. The system starts buckling. 2015, Ireland announces the double Irish is closed for new entrants. 2020, fully phased out. Problem solved, right? Not even close. By then, the corporations had already moved their intellectual property, the recipes, the patents, the brand valuations, to Ireland. The profits keep flowing through Dublin, just with slightly updated paperwork. In 2015, Apple restructured. Economists noticed something strange. Ireland's GDP suddenly jumped by 26% in a single year. Not because the Irish economy boomed, but because Apple moved so many assets to Ireland that it distorted the entire country's economic statistics. Economists started calling it leprechaun economics, a country whose national accounts are so warped by corporate fiction that the numbers mean almost nothing. And then 2026 hits. In January, Trump pulls the United States out of the global minimum tax deal, the one international framework that could have finally forced every country, including Ireland, to charge corporations a minimum 15% rate. Gone. Ripped up. America, out. In February, Trump signs a new global import surcharge. Ireland's pharmaceutical sector, worth tens of billions in exports to the U.S., is directly in the crosshairs. Irish exporters call it Groundhog Day. The U.S. Supreme Court strikes down one round of tariffs. Within days, the White House announces the next round. Here's the contradiction nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Trump is punishing Ireland for a system that American lobbyists built, American corporations ran, and American politicians protected for 30 years. He's not fixing the machine. He's just angry it's running in someone else's backyard. 3 companies, just 3, were responsible for 38% of all Irish corporate tax collected in 2023. Ireland's corporation tax now makes up over a quarter of all government revenue. An entire country's schools and hospitals, funded almost entirely by a handful of American multinationals. Ireland is not running a scam. Ireland is running an addiction, and so is America. The real question was never, why is Ireland doing this? Ireland did what small, desperate economies do. They found a competitive edge, and they used it. The real question is, why did America let it happen for 30 years? Why did the most powerful government on earth watch $1 trillion leave the building and decide, year after year, not to change the locks? Maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of this story. It wasn't a heist in the dark. It was a transfer made in broad daylight. Documented in annual reports, testified to in Senate hearings, reported in newspapers, and nothing changed. Because the people who could have changed it were the same people writing the rules, and they were very comfortable with the rules as written. The Double Irish is technically dead, but the recipes are still in Dublin, the profits are still flowing, and the accountants are already designing the next version, and it won't look anything like this one. If you want me to follow the money on what replaced the Double Irish, the new structures corporations are using right now, drop IP box in the comments, because this story is far from over.